Hope you're having a great weekend. It's our week in review. A look back at some of the most compelling stories, conversations that we've had throughout the week. Hope you enjoy.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast
with Tony Bruschi.
We are continuing our conversation right now with one of the nation's best criminal defense attorneys, Alexandra Kazarian of Garagos and Garagos. And we're talking about the gag order in the trial, or the upcoming trial, possibly, of Brian Kohberger. And is it a benefit? Is it a good thing? We just recently saw some documentation and some clarification, I should say, coming out of the court in favor of the families who wanted to be able to speak without being held back. What is your thoughts on this? Is this a good thing? Is this something that's going to be productive and positive for the prosecution of Kohberger, or the defense, or both in some way, shape, or form?
So in cases like this, I do think gag orders are important. Being a defense attorney, there are definitely times where I don't want it because I want to run out and scream, that this is the evidence that will exonerate my client.
Sure.
And I think everybody needs to know that. But when the investigation is ongoing and evidence is being collected, in a case like this where there's national interest in it and the client is being demonized already, I do think sometimes it helps, because generally what does happen is that the prosecution will take any piece of evidence and blast it, right? And you've got people like Nancy Grace who will use one piece of evidence and spend a week vilifying somebody because of this one piece of evidence. And the defense can't, most of the time in a case like this, especially, get out there and publicize the evidence, because it's going to open up your client to public scrutiny on more than it's going to exonerate them. And the prosecution knows how important it is to make this person a villain. So even if a jury is picked from, somewhere outside of the community, by then, 2-3 years from now, everyone's going to know, they're going to think they know every single detail about the case. So no matter what's presented at the trial, the jury is going to know all of the other evidence that hasn't been allowed in, if it's publicized. So I do think in a case like this, a gag order on the evidence, on the parties who are, the prosecutor and the defense attorney, I think it's really important, because they also are told that they're not allowed to disseminate to the family. Obviously, families should be able to say whatever they want to say. They should never be silenced unless they're actual victims.
Sure.
But families should talk. But I do think in a case like this, at least until we know what the evidence is going to be that's presented to the jury, I think it's really important to keep it in the courtroom.
The other thing I want to get your opinion on, from your position of a defense attorney, obviously all of the rumblings about his attorney, Ann Taylor, and the potential, in some views, saying that it's a conflict of interest with the interactions that she has had with several members of the victims' families over the years. On paper, it may not necessarily look like it is truly a conflict of interest, but aesthetically, it certainly does to the general public. What's your take on all of that?
Well, as long as she's representing him well, as long as he doesn't have a complaint about it, it's his decision. He's the one that holds the right to declare the conflict or not. So if in some situations, I can see how it would help to have an attorney representing you that also knows the family members. Maybe she's got more access to what the family's thinking. Maybe she's able to present issues to the family and ask them questions about the evidence that an attorney who didn't have that connection with them might have. I know it sounds awkward, especially in a murder trial, but sometimes those relationships absolutely help the cordial nature of the case. Obviously it's adversarial for a defense attorney to fight against the prosecutor, but just because it's an adversarial process doesn't mean that you can't be cordial on the outset. I can fight like hell in that courtroom, but still be nice to the victim when I need to be.
Sure. It's one of those things where it makes you wonder, what exactly or how exactly that could play out in the long term, though. Could that potentially be some ammo for Kohberger at the end if he is found guilty to say, this was not right. I shouldn't have had this sort of representation. Or is that something that right now he'd have to speak out about now that everyone knows the fact that there's this potential conflict there? Is he waiving essentially the right to ever say that there is a conflict down the road, depending on whatever the verdict is?
Yes, if he would have to find specific situations where he thinks that conflict has come into play. Mm-hmm. Maybe if he says, I want you to, if there's a preliminary hearing and he tells his client, I want you to attack this victim. I want you to make her look terrible on the stand. She's a liar. I want you to go at her. And he believes that she didn't, mm-hmm. Then yes, he absolutely should make that objection to the judge and declare the conflict and say, I want a new lawyer. He's got to, I think it's going to be very hard for a appellate court to hear for the first time after a conviction, a defendant saying, oh, you know what, now that I think about it, I think there was a conflict there. There has to be something that's going on that's in conflict to your ideas, your rights, your beliefs, your way, the defendant's way that they believe the case should be going. Something that happened that you now believe was a result of the conflict. But yeah, if the lawyer does everything he asks and does it well, then it's going to be very hard for a appellate court mm-hmm. to say, oh, sure, there was a conflict there and you deserved different representation.
So it doesn't just have to be spoken out about prior to the actual trial. If something happens during the trial, and let's say Ann Taylor believes the best way to defend Kohberger is this way, but he wants it done that way. If she doesn't do it that way, is that then grounds for him to say, well, this is what I wanted her to do, and she didn't do it, even if her idea is better? It just, if it doesn't go along with the way he wants to be represented.
Yes. So there's certain situations where it is the lawyer's decision on how to proceed tactically. So there are, if I'm going to ask a certain question, that's my prerogative. I get to decide whether that's a good question to ask or not. When it comes to the actual defense of the case, there are certain situations where it is up to the client. So for example, it used to be that I could, if I thought it would help my client, I could say, look, my client is guilty as to count 2. We're going to concede count 2. I'm going to tell you, I think that the evidence is there for count 2. But count 3, he's absolutely innocent. And there is a tactical reason to do that. You get credibility with the juror when you tell them, look, he may have done something, but it's not this entirety of what he's being accused of. The jury sometimes appreciates that. And it used to be that was up to the trial attorney. There was a Supreme Court ruling that came down that said, no, you can only do that if your client agrees. You cannot. So it used to be that even if my client said, no, I'm innocent of count 2, I don't want you arguing that I'm guilty, I could have still done that. And hopefully it would go the right way, because God forbid if you get convicted, if the client gets convicted and then they argue that you did it against their will, mm-hmm. there could be issues there. But it used to be that could be a trial tactic that the lawyer would decide. Now it is up to the defendant, and you are not allowed to argue something against the defendant's wishes if it points to their guilt. So it just depends. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for Brian Kohberger to make that argument if that's something that he wants to make. But again, every defendant has the right to have the attorney that they choose. So if he has that issue, he should be bringing that up now.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers podcast
with Tony Bruschi.
Alexandra Kazarian, thank you so much for your insight. Alexandra of Garagos and Garagos, named Lawyer of the Year in both criminal and civil arenas. She knows her stuff, one of the best out there. So thanks for that insight. If you want to express your opinion, your theories, your thoughts on anything we're talking about here, you can do so 24/7. The phone number 888-554-5537 or 888-5-KILLER. It's the same thing either way. Killer spells out 888-554-5537. Love to hear your thoughts and your voice on the things and the cases that we're talking about here on the podcast. My name is Tony Bruschi. You can follow me on Twitter at TonyBPod. Stay with us.